I interviewed Kingsmill Bond when he was with Carbon Tracker a number of times, but now he's moved over to the Rocky Mountain Institute. He's written a very, very interesting study on why the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, coupled with the pandemic, is going to speed up the energy transition, particularly in Europe. So I'm going to talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Kingsmill.
Hi, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Well, congratulations on the new gig. And I'm particularly interested, I mean, this is very timely. Everybody is looking at Europe and wondering how in the world they're going to wean themselves off Russian energy in a timely fashion, ramp up the energy transition. And I think that's been a real shock, is that Europe didn't just say, oh, we're going to look for other sources of fossil fuels. They said, no, that might be part of our short-term strategy, very short-term, but we are going to speed up the energy transition. And that's what your report is about, as I understand it. So give us a bit of an overview.
Sure. So we are looking at the consequences of this terrible war and this invasion. And I guess the very first point to make is that this is, to state the obvious, this is a supply shock. And the reason it's a supply shock is because, as you know, Russia is the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels, and they've now fallen out with their largest customer. And, there's just tension, as you can see, on both sides. And the details change every day. But that's the key point, which is that the world's largest fossil fuel exporter is being cut out of the supply of its largest customer. That means that because energy markets are not especially flexible, that means there's going to be stress across the global energy system. So it's a mistake to think this is just a European issue. This is a global issue, and it's going to last for a long time. So when you think about that as a framing, the only other time this has happened really is, of course, in the 1970s, in the famous supply shocks of the 1970s.
Right. And the difference between now and then, of course, is that in the 70s, in 73 and 79, there were no alternatives. But today, we do have alternatives in the form of electricity.
Yeah. So again, if I take this as a framing, high fossil fuel prices, uncertainty, what happens, first of all, is that energy security comes to the front of mind. So there are two primary consequences of this shock. First is that energy security is now top of mind for every energy minister in the world. And the second then is that the tipping point where renewables beat fossil fuels is also brought forward by several years. So BNEF, for example, is now saying that green ammonia can compete with fossil fuel ammonia. Green hydrogen even compete with fossil fuel hydrogen. And the same thing is now happening right across the world in lots of different sectors. So two primary consequences, the political and the economic. And then to answer your question, when it comes to, if we put this in the framework again of the 1970s, what happened last time round is that governments did two things. They massively increased energy efficiency. So as a result of that, oil demand, which had been rising at about 4% a year for several decades, stopped rising. And then the second thing they did is they turned to the new energy technology of the time, which of course was nuclear. So if you put this in today's context, now politicians are going to be hunting for ways to get domestic energy for their energy security. They're going to be searching for ways to improve efficiency, and they're going to precisely, as you say, be looking for the more rapid deployment of alternative solutions, which is these new energy technologies.
So we understand the context around Europe because Europe is the most vulnerable and it's dealing with a war in its midst. And so we understand, why the EU nations are doing what they're doing. But there's another opportunity that you talk about in your paper, which is the opportunity for the global South to increase their own energy security by leapfrogging over fossil fuel infrastructure and speeding up the transition to large scale renewables and other electric technologies.
Yeah, this is precisely the point. I mean, because energy is global and prices are global, and because Europeans are now spreading out around the world hunting for more energy sources, global fossil fuel prices are higher. That means that the pressure is higher, in fact, on the global south, even than it is on Europe. So, for example, Germany's fossil fuel imports as share of GDP before this crisis are about 3%. India, it's 5%. So when I talk to my friends in India, they are feeling the pressure of this crisis even more intensely because of the pressure on the rupee and the pressure on the current account balance. So what it really means, therefore, is that they too have the same incentives. In fact, of course, in the global south, the incentives are even greater because you've got a massive pollution problem and you've got even less infrastructure being built. An even greater incentive, of course, to leapfrog and go to these new energy technologies rather than making the same mistake that we did, as people say.
Now, within Europe, I'm fascinated by Germany's response. I mean, they've committed $200 billion over the next 3-4 years to speeding up the energy transition. What can you tell us about Germany? So
German policy, as you say, has turned on a dime, both in terms of security and in terms of the energy transition. And I think it's really important, and let's take Germany as an example, but it's really important to distinguish between the short term, what happens in the next 6 months as people scramble around desperately trying to find alternative sources and keep open nuclear, keep open coal, buy LNG, whatever the short-term solutions is, versus the really interesting thing, which is the fact, precisely as you say, that they're allocating more money to speed the energy transition faster in order to get off their fossil fuel dependency more rapidly. And I think the other point that again was made in a conversation I had this afternoon by 2 German participants was that the innovations and solutions being found in Germany are going to be spread globally. Of course, in the same way that as happened with solar a couple of decades ago. And so we should be very cognizant as Europe finds solutions. So both other countries will deploy them. And of course, Europe will now be extremely incentivized to encourage other countries to deploy these solutions because they also want to reduce the pressure on energy sources.
Now, this leads me to another point, and it's about supply of these clean energy technologies. So right now, the percentage of wind turbine manufacturing, solar panel manufacturing, and battery manufacturing that's controlled by China is extraordinary. I think it's 50% in the case of wind turbines, and it goes up to 90% in the case of batteries. And so is this an opportunity for countries like Germany to say, okay, we need to ramp up our domestic production of these technologies. We'll put public money into it. And this will be, well, yes, it'll be painful in the short term, but we'll actually come out of this better because not only will manufacture everything we need or most of what we need at home, creating economic growth and jobs and investment.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. And of course, it's kind of Europe's Sputnik moment, where Europe wakes up and realizes that it's far too dependent for its critical energy technologies on foreign sources. But it's not just Europe, of course, it's a problem right across the West. So one of the consequences, I suspect, of this shock and the growing bifurcation of the world is that the West inevitably is going to build up its own renewable energy supply chains, especially in, of course, solar. And again, talking to my friends in India, that's one of their core goals right now.
Right. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But can they scale it up? I mean, we're talking a massive increase in scale on things like offshore wind, EV manufacturing, battery production, all of that. I mean, the scale of the increase in manufacturing in those areas is just, it's hard to contemplate. Is there enough minerals? Is there enough capital? Is on and on and on.
Well, I mean, Markham, China's done it. Why can't we? Basically, it has been done already, in fact. No, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I mean, then when it comes to this question of minerals, look, again, the World Bank's done a very good analysis of this, and so have several other people. And the numbers are pretty stark. I mean, there's plenty of minerals in the world's crust. We don't have the mines yet to get them out, so we need to increase our mining capacity. And people often say, well, these are very damaging, they're very bad for the environment, all the rest of it, because of all the negative aspects of minerals. And we've written various papers on this. But to give you one number I was playing with today, so someone was making the argument we need 600 million tons of additional minerals in order to build out the necessary infrastructure for the energy transition. That's a one-off number, by the way, not annual. Versus annual, you need 14,000 million tons of fossil fuels. So I mean, it's basically 700 times more fossil fuels over a 30-year period than the minerals required for renewables. So it's a big ask, but actually that's another reason why this terrible war is such an important catalyst, because it's at times of crisis and war that people make changes that they really needed to do anyway.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you're based in the UK, so you've got your finger on the pulse of public opinion and the energy conversation around the war and the energy transition. What are people saying? Is there public support for these kinds of wrenching changes that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, first of all, they won't necessarily be wrenching. Closing down a coal-fired power station and putting up a wind turbine is not wrenching. Putting an EV charger on a street corner. These are not actually wrenching changes. So that's the first observation I would make. But if it's not just in the UK, I mean, as you know, Markham, as well as I do, I mean, the data on when people are asked, do they want to embrace a renewable energy future all across the world, from China to the United States, to India to Europe, it's extremely popular, the energy transition. And yeah, I mean, the answer is people do want to embrace it. And in fact, sitting in the UK, I must tell you, I'm quite embarrassed by the low quality of my own government's energy strategy right now. I'm not the only person to be saying this. Michael Grubb, professor of energy at UCL, has a very interesting analysis of this in the Financial Times. But the point to me is that politicians will, over time, inevitably up their game as the stresses increase, I would suspect.
Now, you and I have talked about energy narratives in previous interviews, and I was very interested to see that you had a section in your study about the change in the narrative that these changes will bring about. And the one that you pointed out is that the change to the narrative that energy transitions take a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a kind of staple that energy transitions take forever, led by your own dear Canadian Václav Smil, who's always banging on about this. So first of all, it will become increasingly clear that you can indeed change quite rapidly. I mean, again, the question is, what do you mean by quite rapidly? You can't do much in a year, but you can do a lot in 10. And that's precisely what Europe is now aspiring to do. So I think that's one consequence. The other point about this, which I've always emphasized, I think it's worth always remembering, is that there is no dispute, actually, that it will take decades to go from 14,000 million tons of of fossil fuels to zero, right? There is no debate about that. Everyone agrees. The question really is, what happens? How quickly can you go from 14,000 to 13,900? How quickly can you peak and start to decline? And of course, you can create a peak and start to decline incredibly quickly. And one of the key messages of this piece of analysis was simply to say, look, because solar and wind are such a large part of the system, all you have to do is tweak a tiny bit with your assumptions, increase efficiency a little bit, increase the growth of solar and wind a little bit, and not merely will peak fossil fuel demand be behind us in 2019, but you could actually fall off a cliff quite rapidly as a result of changes to those parameters.
Well, I make this point all the time in columns and in the energy transition analysis, is that energy transitions take 50 to 75 years. The first 20 or 30 are very slow because all of these technologies, they're new and they're not competitive right away. And it takes time for them to get into the marketplace, come down in cost, come up in value, begin to be accepted by consumers. But then about 25 or 30 years in, which is where we are now in this energy transition, boom, the technology is competitive. It begins to move the old technology out of the marketplace, and you have a very, very disruptive 10 or 15 years, i.e. the 2020s. And it's almost like the energy system was primed and ready to speed up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it's all about, as you say, tipping points on S curves and getting to price parity and getting large enough to start taking all of the growth. And again, I mean, we've written about this many, many times, but what's interesting when we come to talk about this question of peaking demand is, don't forget, there are many peaks behind us as well as the peaks we see right now. So for example, US fossil fuel demand peaked 15 years ago. European fossil fuel demand peaked in 2006. Global ICE car demand peaked in 2018. You know, they're actually quite global, according to the IEA's data. It slightly depends how you cut it, but global demand for fossil fuels for industry peaked actually in 2014. You know, there are many peaks which have been happening and are indeed now happening around us. So we shouldn't be surprised. But I totally agree with your point, Markham, which is that we should expect a lot of disruption in the 2020s as these technologies are now basically big enough and cheap enough to cause a lot of marginal damage. That's the key point. It's marginal change, which is really being impacted by the growth of this stuff.
Well, let's talk about regional differences in growth, because as you say, gasoline and diesel, has been peaking in Europe. Gasoline has peaked in, I think it was 3 years ago in the US, and so on. And I think everybody agrees that the energy transition is not going to be symmetrical. It's not going to affect all regions of the world at the same time. The global South will be behind Europe and North America and China and so on. But does this shock that we're talking about and this acceleration, does that give countries like Vietnam and Korea and so on, that might be in China's shadow, for instance, does it give them pause and say, you know what, maybe we're a little vulnerable on the energy security side. Maybe we should accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, this whole concept of global South versus global North is very misleading when it comes to the energy transition. I mean, there are basically, if you want to play with groups of countries, I would suggest there are four. There's the OECD, where fossil fuel demand peaked about 15 years ago and is in decline anyway. There's China, where demand per capita is now the same as, for example, in Europe, and the peak is some stage between now and 2030, but it's pretty flipping close. Then you've got petrostates, where their demand's already huge anyway, but it's not really growing. And and then finally you've got the rest of the global South, where interestingly enough they're just not following in the footsteps of China because they don't need to. So I suppose that's certainly the way I'm thinking about it. And in fact, this debate is incredibly finely balanced. If you look at the global South ex China, for example, as we did, you'll find that 2/3 of those countries have already seen peak demand for fossil fuels for their electricity. It's a much more varied narrative than I guess you might imagine. Anyway, yeah. So I think change is happening. It's a mistake to think that everyone is going to follow in the footsteps of China and the West.
Now, to finish off our conversation, Kingsmill, to what extent are these shocks going to bring about permanent change in the energy transition pace? Because I think, we're 2 months into Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. It's not going to stop tomorrow, but what if it stopped in a month? What if they came to a ceasefire and some kind of a resolution in a month or 2 months? Are these now these changes, the change in thinking amongst governments and industry and citizens, are they baked into the cake now? Or is there a chance that once things, if there is a resolution, that we slide back into old thinking?
Well, I mean, first of all, I fervently hope that there is a solution to this appalling war and the destruction of life of my friends in Ukraine. It's just appalling. So I hope that there is, for sure. Would that necessarily mean that we would go back to our old ways? Well, clearly not, certainly not in Europe, because Europe has seen the risk of being dependent upon Russian fossil fuels. So Europe certainly wants to continue to shift away from Russian fossil fuels, and therefore Russia from fossil fuels. And then Russia can't just flip its fossil fuel export system, particularly for gas, immediately, and even within 5 years, to the rest of the world. I mean, it takes time. So there will be a long period of stress, come what may. And then, of course, there is the residual point, which is that everyone has now seen once more very, very clearly what happens if you are a fossil fuel importer and your exporter can just threaten you by cutting a fossil fuel. So I think I hope that the conflict finishes immediately, but I don't think that will change hearts and minds dramatically on the transition risk.
Kingsmill, it's always a pleasure to chat with you, and thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Markham.